All right, so let's start with this. Something I've been thinking about a lot. There is in history the school of thought known as, with the usual gender bias of Western civilization, known as the great man theory. And the great man theory postulates that there are powerful personalities, of course, calls them great men because they were unaccustomed to the notion of a woman being a political or governmental ruler. So the great man theory says if there hadn't been Hitler, there wouldn't have been Nazism. If there hadn't been Roosevelt, the history of the United States would have been somewhat different, and so on, going back to the Caesars and that sort of thing. And then there is another more structural interpretation of history that looks at forces over time, shifting needs and interests, very much economic in nature, but also sociological, anthropological, basically says at the other end of this spectrum of belief that historical figures fall in place as a result of greater forces. And I've been wondering about all this in the context of Donald Trump, because as it was brought again to my mind and lately because I saw somebody write the other day that Donald Trump has changed the arc of history, that like him or not, he has, and I think we're clear on that, he's changed the course of history. And I am not sure either way about it, but let me tell you what I think, and then I'd love to get your thoughts. I think that a crisis was inevitable in Western so-called liberal democracy and its financial system, its economic beliefs, and so structurally, I think a crisis of some kind was inevitable. It could have been a disastrous recession. It could have been war. And I think rather than think of Donald Trump as great in any sense, I think he's an extremely important figure, that I would say he's our disaster. That he is, there were inherent contradictions in the way this country, in particular, thinks of itself, thinks of economics, thinks of the arc of history, and something was going to happen to break that. And right now, that something is Trump. But first of all, what do you think of the premise, and what do you think of my theory?
Well, I think it's a very important topic. I'm very glad you chose to put it or bring it to the forefront for us today. Um, I am, the way you set it up, I am a structuralist. That is, I am very much of the mind that history produces the individuals a lot more than the other way around. I do admit it's both ways. It's not that the individual is merely the puppet of a puppeteer we can call history. No, the puppet has its contradictions. The very fact when you say it, if you think about it, history, all of the things that impinge on each of us, on Mr. Trump, on you, on me, on everyone in our audience, they push and pull us in an endless opposition, if you like. This person is pushing us in that way, and that one is pushing, literally, the newspaper pummels your brain with different perspectives. So, in the end, everything you do has to be, in a sense, original, because you are the place where all of these individually different and often clashing influences, that's where they all come together, and you have to navigate it somehow. And how you do that reacts back on all those influences in a kind of, if you allow me, dialectic of interaction. So, and I think that's true of Mr. Trump also. But I would like to say, and here comes the structuralism, that the most important thing I think you said that I would pick up on is that there are contradictions that have come to a head, and you can call that a crisis, you can call that a nodal point, as one of my professors once did. But whatever you call it, a whole lot of problems accumulated, and you might say they accumulated without quite reaching a crisis point in the prior presidents, Obama and Bush, Clinton, and so on. Um, but they are now intense. They are now aggravated, intensified, and so we see dramatic action. But again, it's because of what has accumulated, rather than Mr. Trump. Because after all, I mean, with all due respect, and I really do mean those words, um, this is not a man who has ever before distinguished himself in any way that I'm aware of by his social insights, by his political anything. He was the right man at the right time. He reminds me constantly of that movie, which I found absolutely entrancing. The last movie, I think it was the last movie of Peter Sellers, called Being There, about the famous gardener in Washington, D.C., who becomes the president. If you've never seen the film, folks, really, it's worth going and excavating it from the archives, because it suggests how, in this case, a um, uh, what's the word I want? A mentally challenged gardener fumbles and bumbles his way to the presidency and does a perfectly okay job, because it's all the situations that brought him to this, so that Donald Trump stops being an overprivileged playboy in New York nightclubs to being the president at this time. And and again, yes, he has an influence. I don't mean to make him merely a puppet. On the other hand, uh, he's the center of attention, not so much because of him. When we compare him, say, to Mr. Macron or Mr. Starmer or Mr. Mertz, these people are all leaves in the wind being carried along in a process they very dimly understand, and probably in moments of candor they admit it. I'm reminded, in the case of Trump, of something he said early on, which he has repeated, that he discovered one day that he could go out onto Fifth Avenue where he lived and shoot somebody, and somehow it wouldn't damage him or put him in a difficult situation. And that was his way of saying, I have no idea really what's going on, but wow, does it give me a chance.
Well, a couple of things occurred to me while you were talking, Richard Wolff. One of them was, there's that saying, nature abhors a vacuum. And I think historical forces, historical nature, if you will, abhors a vacuum too. But I think it creates them and then fills them. And I think that's part of what you're talking about. So I think about, for example, the the internal delusions that the United States of America has been operating on for many, many, many years. One example being the 19th century concept of manifest destiny, right? We had, by we, I don't mean you and I, we weren't here, but United States and its leaders, the prevailing ideology was we were going to expand westward and seize all the land between here and there, displacing the native peoples, displacing the other colonial forces that might be there, because that was God's will for us, our destiny made manifest in imperial rule of North America, or this part of North America. I think that has never gone away. In fact, it happened simultaneously with industrialization, right? So we had the less visible manifest destiny of capitalism, which also requires constant expansion. So now we've run out of frontier. We've run out, arguably, with the climate crisis and everything else, we've run out of the raw material for capitalism's expansion, or we're soon to. And it seems to me that what Trump represents now is that belief, both economically and ideologically, taken to its most absurd extreme. Manifest destiny, we're going to take Greenland with 80,000 people. Manifest destiny, maybe we'll take Canada. It's become, maybe we'll build resorts in Gaza. So, of course, it's brutal and inhumane, but there's an absurdity about it. And the way he's been trying to project American economic force through tariffs and threats and so on, it seems to me more, yes, the U.S. can do big damage to other countries with its trade policy, but it seems to me more of what Richard Nixon described as the United States as a pitiful, helpless giant swinging, flailing as it goes down. But it seems to me that when I look at it that way, Trump seems more like a symptom than the disease.
No. I think so. I really do think in the end, however much agency you give him, and he gets some, he is in the end much more pummeled this way and that by the forces he very dimly understands than he is in charge really of anything. And I get that feeling also because I have such a deep sense of the desperation of all these people that they don't know what they're doing. They haven't the time or the leisure or the historical space to think through what they are doing, and so they take steps that are nutty. That let me give you an example. The second most the country that uses the Panama Canal, second to the United States, which is its major user, is China. And in the course of years and years of passage through the Panama Canal without the slightest problem at all, Mr. Trump says to himself, probably in the same moment that he decided to rename the Gulf of Mexico, well, he's now going to snatch the Panama Canal back. Remarkable. Okay. Well, what's the reality here? Well, the reality is that the facilities that he was concerned about, apparently, were facilities owned by an international enormous company. It's been around for a very long time, has no political character to it that anyone has ever noticed. C.K. Hutchinson is the name of the company. Been there a long time, based in both Hong Kong and I actually think somewhere in the Caribbean. They have another headquarters. Anyway, you're not taking something from China. What Mr. Trump did is he created a forced sale. I don't know exactly why, but the BlackRock company bought the facilities in Panama of Hutchinson. Okay, this is stupid. First of all, in order for the Panama Canal to function, it has to charge people going through. What is the United States going to do? Not let the Chinese go through? That's shooting yourself in the foot. If you're going to then lose money off of what you just purchased. What? Why would you? What's the point of this? And here are the costs. Every other large global company now functioning anywhere will be newly considering which of its facilities are in a comparable position to Hutchinson's facilities in Panama, so that these kinds of desperate presidents are going to snatch or force them to sell at a fire sale price some facilities that they have been operating for many, many years quietly, efficiently, and profitably. And this is going to be very bad as they make all their little decisions. I'll give you a similar example in Europe. they stole. There's no nice word for this. They stole 300 billion of reserves from Russia as part of the sanctions. Okay, every major international financial expert that they've consulted, and they've consulted quite a few, has told them it's bad that you're taking the interest on that, which they already have, but you cannot take the product itself. That is, you're going to be sorry because it means that nobody can keep their reserves. Every little country in the world that used to make you a nice bundle by keeping their central bank reserves in London or Paris or something, they're not going to do that anymore. They're not going to be stuck with you're not. Do you really want to do that? Is it really worth it for you? Yeah, 300 billion is a lot of money, but if you put in a larger scale, they never answer. They may do it now. By the way, they have in the last 2 or 3 days, that dead idea has been brought to life again because they are desperate. Now that Mr. Trump is saying that NATO's life is over, et cetera, they are desperate. But these are acts of desperation. And then again, to your point, it's the circumstances that make them desperate, not something innate to them.
Now, a couple things occur to me about that, and I think an area we should explore, again, in this topic of structural versus personality is, yeah, I want to be clear. My opinion on Trump is that the way in which, the most dramatic way that I think he's a change agent is by taking some openly fascistic steps, in, as we understand fascism, of having a billionaire come in and overrule the laws that Congress has made and terrorize employees and suck up enormous amounts of data. And I wrote a piece about the enormous value of that data, which people aren't talking about at all. It's basically stealing a public resource. So I don't minimize those aspects of Trump, but it is also striking to me, you know, and struck me again as you were talking, the ways in which what Trump is doing is a continuation of what his predecessors, Republican and Democratic, have done. The fact is, Joe Biden, I think the original seizure of the Russian reserves happened under Biden, if I recall correctly. Massive increases in military spending under Biden. Again, in keeping with the bipartisan jacking up of military expenditure, characteristic of a failing empire, I would say. But we also saw, yes, Donald Trump seems to be preparing some sort of very anti-democratic moves to stifle free speech. He already is, in terms of cracking down on discussions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so on. But Joe Biden was also extreme in cracking down on different free speech about Palestine, about Gaza, about our policies in the Middle East, beating our students and arresting them and that kind of thing. So that's why I say I think we're in a close approximation of each other on this, in that I think that Trump is doing extremely disturbing things, and I think we need to be constantly calling out the open fascism, including the Heil Hitlers, which, as far as I'm concerned, are Heil Hitlers. I think their behavior overall reflects that. But at the same time, understanding that there is a syndrome, there is a set of symptoms that are emblematic of an underlying disease that precede Trump. And they include censorship. They include ever-increasing militarization. They include breaking of international law, mockery of international law, on and on and on. So Trump is buffoonish when he wants to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America or whatever. But we also, I would argue, Biden was buffoonish in arguing to use international law against Putin and then immediately defying international law in Israel. So one is more blatantly absurd than the other, but that's a matter of style. So what do you think about this idea that these symptoms are pointing to an underlying illness?
I agree, and I want to name it. I think what we're seeing, you know, there are two historical pieces that come to my mind. One is a famous Russian Marxist named Georgy Plekhanov wrote a famous book years ago about the individual in history. And he posed to himself in that book the same issue that you began this program with. You know, what is the role of the individual in history? And the other thing that comes to my mind historically is kind of a general conclusion that many historians arrived at, not all, but many, about how to explain the rise of Hitler, Mussolini, Franco in Spain, and so on. And the argument went something like this, that it was a, quote, crisis of capitalism. If you think about the worst example, Germany, Hitler, Nazis, right? They lost World War II, which they never anticipated they could or would. That was followed at the end of the war, 1918. 5 years later, they had one of the worst inflations that we have in recorded history, when the value of their currency literally went to nothing. The Deutschmark, you needed 10 million of them for $1. I mean, it was ridiculous. That's 1923. And then 5 years later, the crash of 1929, that's too much for a capitalism to handle. It can't lose a world war, have the worst inflation, which wipes out all the savings of the German people up until that time, a very frugal people, by the way, but their savings had been reduced by the inflation to worthlessness. And then the Great Depression that takes away their job, having had the inflation take away their savings. They blew up as a people, which made it possible for Hitler to come in as a demagogue and take advantage of what capitalism had done to these people and to itself, at least in Germany. And so enforcing the system to go back to work when nobody was able to do it saved that system. Fascism kept it going around what? Foreign adventure, nationalism gone crazy, scapegoating of immigrants, real or imagined, etc., etc. We're seeing an awful lot that is similar to all of that. A capitalism that, just is no longer able to function. And here's a symptom that I think people will see. It's always true. It's a boring truism that what the government does could be done more efficiently. By the way, it's an equal truism that everything a private bureaucracy is undertaking could be done more efficiently. That's why there's industries that exist to sell to the service of every private corporation an efficiency study and an efficiency reworking of what you're doing. And it's crazy to look upon what Trump and Musk are doing as if it had anything remotely to do with efficiency, or even that it had anything remotely to do with patriotism. This morning's headlines indicate that there's a leaked memo that's been verified now that the Veterans Administration is planning to fire, get ready, 83,000 employees. Those are the veterans whose services are going to be cut by such a thing. This is taking a meat cleaver and doing the work that way. It's clear what they're doing, isn't it? That they need to extend the tax cuts of 2017. They can only do that with massive borrowing. They are committed to not do that. And so they're going to cut the government. And therein, final point. This is the old business mentality. The government is a burden. It only threatens us with taxes. We would all be better off if the government were not there. Then private enterprise would do it all better. This is a religious commitment that has been part of American history. All that Musk and Trump are doing is reviving it with more intensity because everything is falling apart. Therefore, all the niceties are gone. We're going to take over Canada. We're going to take over Mexico. We're going to snatch Greenland. We're going to. This is the desperate behavior of people who have only the religion to fall back on because otherwise everything's falling apart.
And at the same time, I recall the last time you and I spoke a couple weeks ago, I was complaining, in my usual high-minded way, of course, about the ludicrousy of policymakers and economists fixating so much on private sector jobs and growth at the expense of public sector jobs, jobs working for government. And I made this sort of pedestrian point. A job is a job as far as a person is concerned, right? If you have one, that's good. If you don't, that's bad. That's the working point. If you work for Social Security Administration, let's say you're also doing a lot of people a lot of good. Right. Now they're cutting even more, although the workload of each worker has already gone up tremendously. And I wanted to add, just to kind of buttress your point, and Mr. Trump's Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, I don't know how it's pronounced, Bessent, is telling us that the government should stop recording total job numbers and should only record private sector job numbers, which would have the twofold impact of, I haven't looked at, I haven't studied it in detail, but it seems that it would have the twofold impact of hiding what they're doing by putting so many people out of work and focusing policy and policy decisions solely on what's good for the private sector. But that speaks to me, again, of failure, of flailing, of, this demonizing of government work. Strikes me like when the body has that condition where it starts rejecting its own parts, right? The body politic is rejecting a part of itself, the government that it's created. So, and that ends in death if it isn't stopped. So I don't know, any thoughts on what I just said?
Yes, yeah. For me, this is all a kind of I would call it a libertarian delirium. It's this notion that the government is a burden, this refusal to remember why government regulation was brought in the first place. Every scandal of rotten meat being sold to the public, every scandal of the roadway badly built so the cars crashed into each other. Every one of the regulations, utility regulation, insurance, because of the abuse that the private sector's maximization of profit rule suffered or imposed on the people. That's why it's there. You would have to believe, as they do, these folks, that the entire 100 years of accumulated regulations paid for by taxes was all done by idiots, all done by people with no grasp of the deep truth you possess, which is we don't need the government, we don't have to have the government, we'll all be better off. If you can't solve the problems of your life, in many cases, right, human beings revert to things they learned in childhood, to little rules of thumb, to their religious upbringing, in the hopes of turning in that direction will somehow magically make it all work out. I think that's what you're seeing. The denouncing Russia. I remember when it began back in February of 2022, denouncing Russia because a big country was invading a little one. Here I am, an American citizen whose modern life has been shaped profoundly by Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, every one of which is a big, powerful country invading a small, poor one. And none of us ever thought that it had to be denounced per se. But let the Russians do it in Ukraine, and I'm not justifying what they did. I had no interest in doing that. But the self-blindness involved here is stunning.
And then the response one gets, since I've made that same point myself, of course, many times, the response one often gets is you are engaging, you meaning you or me, in some sort of moral relativism, or we complain about the other guy. We complain, we're justifying it. The opposite is true. We're
Right.
saying we condemned it when we did it. We condemn it when he does it. But
Right.
why is it that you only care when somebody else does it? The reaction I often get is rage, and I guess I'd like to, like maybe for our last theme about this, get on that a little bit, because I'm well aware that there are many ways in which people's lives, particularly within the United States, perhaps elsewhere, are going to be worse because Trump won than they might have been under Kamala Harris. People on Social Security may suffer. People on anti-poverty programs will suffer. So on people on Medicaid peers, they will suffer. I don't diminish any of that, but it seems that part of that anger that you and I get sometimes, I'm assuming you get it, that comes from the fact that all of that can be true, but it doesn't address the underlying dysfunction that some of these remedial steps are meant to paper over. In other words, instead of anti-poverty programs alone, why don't we end poverty, which we have the capability of doing? And so why are we spending God knows how much $1 trillion or more, really, and when you count all of it, on the military, and so on and so on and so on. So it seems to me that makes it more imperative than ever to point out not only that we're all suffering from this disease, but that the disease has a name, and we can't just address the symptoms or prepare for palliative care as we approach the end. We have to address and name the disease so that we can solve it. And I'll leave that to you as to what we should call the disease.
Well, it's the thing that in America you can't speak. You can say that, we need to change this system, the education system, the transportation system, the pension system. But when it comes to that word capitalism, no, nobody can know what. Oh, no. If you have that in your mind, as I do, because of where I'm coming from and what I do for a living, then maybe people can understand when I say it this way. When I read social analysis, I read an unbelievably tortured effort by the writer, and this includes those I admire and those I don't, but all of them, with very few exceptions, are working overtime, unconsciously, I suspect, to cleanse their work of any hint that there might be the capitalist system as having some role to play. And as a simple example, I use a metaphor. If you take your children to the park, and in the park, as you're playing, you discover there's a man with a cart who sells ice cream. You take your two children over to the cart, you chit chat, and you buy 2 ice cream cones, and you hand them to one of your 2 children. Right? We all know what's going to happen. The one who didn't get an ice cream cone, observing the sibling who got 2 of them, is going to start to make a scene one way or another. And that will alert you to the fact that you made a terrible mistake. And you will then take a cone from one of them, the one who got 2 of them, causing God knows what psychic grief to them in order to correct but you'll at least learn, unless you are really dumb, what it is you did wrong. We live in a country, we always have, in which we give billions to some people and not enough to eat to others. Then we come along with a Medicaid program and an anti-poverty program to take a little bit back from those we gave too much to prevent the death of those we gave too little to, causing enormous social tension as we fight out. I mean, Obviously, the answer is you got a system that's not working well. It shouldn't give billions to some and nothing to other. That's your problem. Not figuring out which redistribution to use, but to obviate it. But that can't be spoken. It can't, by the very people who are honestly struggling to deal with this social problem. I give them, they're honest, they mean well, they intend well, they're well educated, but they have a taboo that they're not aware of. And it's as profound as the taboo that says if you're in a hot room with other people having dinner, but it's a little uncomfortable, you don't remove your pants. Because it's just, we don't do that. It's
Right.
not, it would be cooling you. Nobody is going to see anything that they haven't already seen in their life, but we can't do it. We can't, and as long as we do that, we are crippled in a way that prevents us from thinking clearly.
Well, I don't like the pants analogy quite as much okay, so we'll have to end here. I guess I will end by saying the real tragedy of your ice cream story is that the little boy who got two cones grew up and gave a speech at Davos where he explained that yes, he got two cones, but his sister had a reasonably nutritious breakfast, so the system is working like it's supposed to.
Yes, exactly.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.